Welcome to Faith Across Borders. I'm your host, Graham Joseph Hill. Faith Across Borders is a podcast that is catalysing innovative Christian faith through global conversations and local initiatives. Each week we bring you insightful conversations with experts, leaders and visionaries around the world who bring new perspectives in growing your faith in your spiritual journey. Today's guest is Ruth Padilla DeBorst, a renowned teacher, speaker and practitioner with decades of ministry throughout Latin America and the rest of the world. For sponsorship inquiries, please email faithacrossborders@gmail.com. Please stay tuned. At what stage in life did you decide to join with God in His mission, and what was happening for you at the time?
It's hard to even put a date.
Yeah.
I think it was a progressive understanding of the fact that as God's daughter, I was called to be part of God's work. And that grew as I grew. From when I was a child, I grew up in a Christian family with a very strong sense of God's calling to all God's people.
How would you define integral mission, and how does the church engage in integral mission today?
So integral mission, I understand as having to do with all dimensions of life. It has to do with how we live as families, as churches, as communities, even the structures of society. And so it has to do with the whole. Integral comes from the word, when you have a loaf of bread, we have grain. You have a grain of wheat, and typically to make it white, as the fluffy bread people eat, you have to take things off. You have to discard things. But the integrality and integral bread in our context, the concept is used, has to do with all of it there, the wholeness of it present. And so how do churches engage? I think specifically engaging in all dimensions of life under Christ's lordship. So saying we're not a Sunday called to just a Sunday faith. We're called to a Monday through Sunday faith that works itself out into all areas of life. And churches then would help their members understand their gifts and how their faith bears on their value systems, on their relationships, on their contributions to the larger society also.
You've written quite a bit on Christian hospitality. What does biblical hospitality look like?
Yeah, I think sometimes we think about mission as something we do out there.
Yeah.
We have to go to do mission work. And actually, I think more of the biblical calling is to be a people of God and to, as we live that out, then have open homes, open churches, open borders, open to welcome, to include. Because, I look at Ephesians 2 and the call of being a community that reflects Christ's uniting, peacemaking role in the world. The community as such, breaking down barriers that separate people, is what shows most potently God's good purposes for God's world. And it seems kind of, it's really almost shocking to think that we, with all our brokenness, all our prejudice, all our greed, that we as God's people are God's dwelling place in the world. And so if we are God's home in the world, then we're called to welcome others into that home.
And you said that hospitality involves building homes and living sustainably in them, our relationships, our care for creation, seeking the welfare of the city. Can you unpack some of those ideas for us?
Yeah, I'm really struck by the biblical imagery, particularly in this case. I was probably referring to Jeremiah 29 and the call to a people in exile, being held by their enemy forces, being uprooted from their land. Their idea of well-being, of goodness, could have been to return to, so they weren't very present in the land of exile. And yet God says, have children, have grandchildren, let your children marry and have grandchildren, plant and eat the fruit. A fruit tree doesn't yield fruit for several years until you can enjoy the fruit of a tree. It means strike roots. It means really belong. It means engage, and then pray for the city, the peace of the city where you're located, because the peace of the city is in the peace of the city is your peace. So you're intertwined with these people that you consider enemies. You're actually called to be a part of that place and to be, to reflect God's, the values of God's kingdom in that place. So it's an amazing call.
How do we welcome unexpected guests to God's multifaceted, multicultural banquet table?
It's a challenge because in these days, with the movement of people and the migrations provoked by injustice, by wars, by hunger, by poverty, the movement of people is just such a threat to things as they are and to my comfort. If my things are okay and I got what I need, having somebody start knocking on the door of my country or my church or my house is threatening. And I think the challenge really is that we cannot expect to live sustainably as humanity with things as they are. We can't just throw out a few little crumbs to people to bring them up, to develop them without changing our own lifestyles if we have lifestyles of comfort that are built on an unjust system. So it's even more threatening. Does the gospel mean I have to change? Does it mean I have to maybe let go of some things, of some of the privilege accumulated through ages of, some of us with opportunities for education and such? We have a capital that we take for granted. And does it mean I just try to give to others to bring them up to my level? That's unsustainable. The world cannot sustain the lifestyle of much of the West, North, without surrendering something.
I mean, this topic of welcome and hospitality is a critical one always, I suppose, but at the moment it seems especially acute. I mean, watching recent presidential debates and the kind of rhetoric that's going around all of this, I wonder what it would mean for us as Christians to provide a different kind of welcome than the world is used to.
Yes, and the issue to me is this: where does our ultimate allegiance lie? Is our allegiance to some humanly constructed nation state with all its institutions and its tight borders? Or is our allegiance as sons of and daughters of the Lord, of all people, is our allegiance to a kingdom that transcends those nationalities? And then, if that's the grounds for our core identity, then probably we need to start questioning policies and actions and attitudes and values that are excluding people. And I know I've been challenged on this because people say, oh, so then you think we should just open our borders and then what do we do? And yes, we will have to grapple with the reality that the structures of the world as it is are not sustaining life for all people. And a few people are very comfortable, and most people are dying either with hunger or war or injustice or lack of opportunity for jobs. And so I think Christians should be at the forefront of questioning anything that's depriving all people of the abundant life that God intends for all people and the whole of creation.
I mean, this debate is a very hot one in my country, Australia, as well, as you probably know. And I sometimes think that it isn't just that the people who are coming look different than us and speak different languages, but also they hold different belief systems, different religious systems, for instance. And it concerns me that often the church can be seen to be at the forefront of unwelcome.
Yes.
And I find that disturbing, and it relates to a lot of the issues that you're talking about.
Right. I think the issue, yes, definitely. It has to do with, sometimes I wonder how much our fear is kind of cast in a fear for religious change and influence, and how much is that we use religion as a bit of a lacquer to cover up
Yes.
what actually is human greed and unwillingness to sacrifice or to change. So I wonder at that, you know. And so is our... And the fact that Jesus and the early church, the model of living is one where people were willing to let go in some way. Jesus himself gives himself away so fully. What does it mean then to follow in Jesus' footsteps?
What's a third culture lifestyle, and how does it affect the way in which we do fellowship and mission today?
A third culture lifestyle. Yes. So I grew up between worlds. My mother is from the US. My father's from Ecuador. I grew up in Argentina. I've lived in Ecuador, in El Salvador, and Costa Rica. I've had to live, I live in between worlds. I'm fluent in English, but my culture is more Latin. And I think that's taught me a bit about this, where our core belonging is. Again, are we just constricted to live within the bounds of one defined cultural milieu, or are we called to build bridges and go beyond it to an allegiance that is more powerful and more significant and more defining of our values and of our lifestyle? And the question again,
I'm wondering how it affects the way in which we engage in fellowship and mission, and even our construction of our identity in Christ.
Right. So that I think I addressed the issue of identity then, having to pull, in a way, in my personal experience, having to pull these different backgrounds together into one whole. Was the work of the Spirit in me, releasing some prejudices. I grew up very angry at the U.S. because I was in Argentina watching the devastation wreaked by political interventions all around Central America, Latin America, military dictatorships supported by the U.S. And I had a mother from the U.S. I was partly that. So how do I put together this in myself? That was God's work of reconciling inside to put my identity together in as God's daughter. But then I think then the issue is, can we, so some of us will probably be more adept at building bridges. But I think the challenge and the opportunity of all this migration and movement of people, which some can perceive as such a threat, can also be such an enriching experience, because we all experience God in ways that are related to our culture and our context and our personal experience. And so if we can offer that to one another, our God grows, not God, but our perception of who God is and how God works, and the multiplicity, the diversity of expressions that are God's way of also connecting with humanity through culture and art and music and perspectives on things. And so if we can release some of our tight, constructed selves built around nationhood and social class and such, then we can open ourselves up to a much richer experience of God and of our calling.
What do you think are some things that the majority world and diaspora communities can teach Western Christians today?
I did an interesting little piece of research once with churches, interviewing pastors and leaders from churches in North America, in the U.S. specifically, and migrants from Latin America that had come, Christians who had come into those churches, and asking that very question. And very clearly, it was a sense of community. The migrant from Latin America coming into a very individualistic society that is also marks the church, this individualism. People share a cup of coffee after church and then they're gone, and that's it. And the migrants would come in and say, well, where, let's come to my home after church. Let's eat together. Let's share. Let's get to have our children play together. And just the building of community was something very powerful in all the instances. Another was just, they said, they opened our eyes. The fact that they started asking questions that the people in a certain little comfortable evangelical ghetto were not asking.
Yep.
They opened our eyes to the rest of the world, not just their country of origin, but the world around us in our context. And they became bridges. They connected us to those people. They didn't just open our eyes and say, oh, there are other Latinos around or Pakistanis or Hmong people, but they actually became bridge builders with those migrant communities. And so it became a challenge to the church to be the church in multi-ethnic contexts where they had before that been very, very closed.
I mean, the reason why I phrased it, what can they teach us rather than what can we learn from them, is because I think there is something about the language that we've got to be aware of as well, and the way in which we position ourselves in relationship to others.
Yeah, so the thing is, to me, it's hard for anybody to be taught who does not choose to learn. And so it's a posture, it's an attitude, it's an openness, it's a willingness to recognize that we don't have it all together, that we need one another in order to get the full picture of the gospel and the whole picture of what we're called to be and do in the world.
Now, what's most misunderstood about the things you say?
So I guess, we respond to people out of the matrices we've grown up in or we've, allowed to shape us. And so when things are brought to us that don't fit our scheme, we have to fit them in somehow. And so sometimes some of us from Latin America are classed as leftists or radicals or liberationists because some of the way we approach scripture and we approach reality and then consequently our mission don't fit exactly the categories that have been established, probably mostly in the North Atlantic. And we tend to question some of those boxes. And so I think the challenge is to really learn to listen to one another, to in some way just have a hospitable heart, have a posture of, well, maybe before I classify and discard, I should listen. And maybe in listening, we can actually recognize that we have a whole lot more in common than not. And that maybe we can learn from one another, and that it can be a rich exchange that gives us a fuller picture of God.
What are some of the things that you're working on over the next couple of years that you're really excited about?
Just a couple?
Well, as many as you want, as many as you feel willing to share.
Well, no, I'm very we're involved, my husband and I and a team, we're involved in theological formation. We call it that. It's not your classic theological education in an academic setting. It's and it's not organized as classic theological education is around these kind of Euro inherited categories: hermeneutics, homiletics, Old Testament, New Testament, and each one in its own little silo. It's organized around life. So our whole curriculum our courses are organized around family, work, society, and church. And so I'm just very excited to continue with this, both a master's program and a certificate level program that are influencing the church around Latin America, and strengthening a broader perspective of the gospel and mission, and who we are as God's people in God's world. So that's very exciting to me. And then also, as I continue engaged in INFIMIT, the International Fellowship for Mission as Transformation, it's seeing this very same type of thing, not an export from Latin America and plunk there, because that would be the same kind of imperial form that we have rejected, but actually offering out of Latin America. This has been helpful for us, this framework, which is more organic, more from the bottom up, more out of life and for life, has been helpful. And so we're constituting working groups around the world of people who are taking this offering and producing their own valuable curriculum. And I just see such a need for that, to nourish the church with solid biblical, theological endeavor. It's saying theology isn't just something you give to people, a little package that I give and you repeat. Theology is something we do. It's a verb. It's something we do theology as we build the bridges between reality, our current context, and what we understand of God's purposes. And we do that for the sake of living more faithfully in the world. So I'm an educator at heart. I don't even identify as a theologian. I'm more passionate about just seeing people discover the wonder of being able to continue doing theology for life, out of life and for life.
Because I guess even models like theological education by extension or diversified theological education, they still have a tendency, I guess, to kind of present packages or silo topics.
Exactly. So this is very interdisciplinary. We're engaging people and saying, there's no dimension of life that is not affected by Christ's lordship. Well, what does that look like? How to grapple with the questions of, some of the things we were talking about before, migration and what does it mean to be a church today in Europe with all the just hundreds of thousands of people clamoring at their borders? What does it look like for Costa Ricans to receive Nicaraguans and Salvadorans? And what does it look like in relationships between countries that have always contested borders? What does it mean to be a Christian in the midst of that? And what should it look like? And then what action do we generate? But we don't act in society out of some ideology, somebody's program. We are called to act out of a vision of God's kingdom and God's justice. So we have to grapple with those questions, and they won't be given to us. We have to work them out together in community.
And you're currently working on a PhD as well. It's kind of impolite to mention a PhD to a PhD student. What is the topic that you're working on your PhD?
So I'm working on a PhD at Boston University, and it's in missiology and social ethics. And I'm actually looking at this very program that we're currently running, but I'm looking at the roots of it. Who, how, when, where, and what exactly were some of the particular dimensions of it that have been so generative of commitment and transformative engagement in context in Latin America, as a bit of a grounds to say look at and make a proposal regarding some of those core ingredients and postures that are essential if theological education is actually going to produce transformation and not just remain in the halls of knowledge and in books and libraries.
Is there anything else you want to say to us today?
Let's, no matter where we are, who the we is, if the we is somebody in the north or the south or the east or the west, I guess my prayer, my yearning is that we be willing to submit to the work of the Spirit in weaving us into a body that does reflect the values of God's kingdom in the world. And is open to welcoming people who are different, and that it is in that community, which is very clear about its identity, but has very porous edges. It's centered on Jesus, but not bounded by church affiliations or such, that it's that body that will reflect God's love in the world and contribute to God's purposes.
Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Faith Across Borders. If you want to stay connected with us and receive updates on future episodes, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on Apple Music and Spotify. You can also follow us on social media at Faith Across Borders to join the conversation and share your thoughts. Stay tuned for more engaging discussions and enlightening episodes.